One. Hello, I am Sven-Erik Rose, and I teach at the University of California, Davis, and my topic today is Ethics and Extremists in the Warsaw Ghetto Writings of Yitskhok Bernshteyn. One of the most vexing aspects of writing by Jews imprisoned in Nazi ghettos for later readers to receive is the prominence of moral judgment, both far-ranging questions of one's own behavior and criticisms, recriminations, and condemnations by Jews in the ghettos of other Jews in the ghettos. With the post-Shoah knowledge that virtually everyone confined to a ghetto perished, and that virtually all strategies for communal or individual self-preservation proved unsuccessful, moral indictment by the murdered of the murdered can be unsettling to countenance. Ethical discourse and judgment is indeed one of the features of wartime writing that marks its temporal specificity, its situatedness in the midst of, not after, the unfolding events. While I deem it inappropriate and beside the point to try now to validate or discredit specific moral viewpoints articulated in ghetto writings, I am interested in ways that moral judgment offers a vital window onto the lived experience of the ghetto years. When understood in phenomenological rather than transcendental terms, ethics are woven into the fabric of the unresolved present. Now is, if you will, ethics' contingent, risk-filled home. In his early theorization of ethical action, Bernshteyn writes, quote, "The unitary and unique world that is experienced concretely," end quote, hinges on one's, quote, "unique participation in that world, one's non-alibi in it," end quote. Ethical engagement is how we often excruciatingly inhabit the concrete present, and attending to the ethical strain in ghetto writing offers a unique window onto victims' phenomenological experience of the shifting ground of the unfolding catastrophe. In this talk, I will take you through a series of texts from the Warsaw Ghetto by Yitskhok Bernshteyn, all preserved in the first cache of the Oyneg Shabbos archive. Although generically diverse, ranging from literary criticism to philosophical theological meditations, sometimes bordering on sermons, to literary vignettes or prose poems, these texts all have their center of gravity in ethics. Following Amos Goldberg's call for attention to how ghetto writings record the radical transformation and disintegration of social and cultural systems of meaning, I trace how Bernshteyn's writings reflect on the changing status of ethics and moral judgment over a 2-year period from autumn 1939 through late 1941. Descended from a renowned Hasidic family, Bernshteyn was born in Plotzk in 1900. Following both traditional and secular education, cheder, yeshiva, gymnasium, then studies in humanities and law at Warsaw University, he taught Jewish religion at a Polish language Jewish state school and was active in Zionist circles. Prior to the war, Bernshteyn published some half-dozen articles, several in early issues of Yivoblätter, on pedagogical and psychological topics, as well as literary criticism. He was killed in an action in early 1943. Taken together, Bernshteyn's far-ranging texts, comprising 43 A4 typescript pages in total, constitute a significant corpus of ghetto writings that has to date received virtually no scholarly attention. A relatively lengthy essay on the classic Yiddish writers Abramovich and Peretz appears to be among the earliest of Bernshteyn's wartime texts. In it, he is chiefly interested in Abramovich and Peretz as two contrasting types of what he calls ethical genius, reminding readers inclined to appreciate these authors' works in purely aesthetic terms that, quote, "Our holy mountain is Sinai, not Parnassus or Olympus. And on Sinai, divine beauty revealed itself through ethical laws, through social laws that establish a just earthly life," end quote. Bernshteyn's persistent preoccupation with ethics allows us to follow an evolution from early confidence and optimism that ethical values could provide Jewish Warsaw an effective means of contending with the crisis initiated by the war, to a vastly more dire situation in which the question of whether people still possess moral agency has fallen into horrific doubt. Some of Bernshteyn's most stunning writing issues from his continued commitment to ethical thought after so many prerequisites of coherent ethical discourse have eroded. His commitment, in other words, to ethics in crisis. Bernshteyn's essay, How the Outbreak of the War Has Affected the Jewish Person's Psyche, is representative of the early pieces he wrote while still optimistic that Jews might be able to learn lessons from the horrors of the war and that those lessons could aid them in collectively weathering the storm. Ostensibly written in autumn 1939, the essay begins in the vein of the quasi-academic articles Bernshteyn published in the early 1930s. Since no empirical research can be conducted under the circumstances, however, Bernshteyn can only ventures that if surveyed, the majority of the Jewish masses would respond that the outbreak of the war had had a positive effect on, quote unquote, the Jewish heart. Shifting from formal academic discourse to the more sermonizing tone that dominates the essay, Bernshteyn suggests that this postulated optimism is a product of the socially leveling effects of the bombardments. Quote, the destruction and wreckage haven't spared the wealthy echelons. The devastating firebombs made no distinction between palace and attic room. By the way, these quotes will be available on the quote sheet under the title of each essay that I mentioned. Continuing the quote, human egoism, Bernshteyn writes, suffered a death knell. End quote. Remarkably, Bernshteyn interprets the early events of the war as a violent concretization of the moral maxim, quote, no fortune helps in the days of wrath, and charity, tzedakah, saves you from death, end quote. A lesson, he continues, quote, written in blood, fire, and smoke, end quote, not merely in words. One further quote, the shared misfortune brought people together, person to person, walls fell away, end quote. Bernshteyn sees the horrible events of the first phase of the war as in alignment with the moral lessons of prophets of old or their contemporary heirs, Musar, preachers. Quote, the most tragic illustrations of the erstwhile prophet and of a contemporary Musar preacher have become reality. Death, with its ineluctable scythe, has cut off children from parents and parents from children, annihilated husband and wife, end quote. The most frightening illustrations, masholim, that a prophet or preacher in the Shevet Musar or Terror Musar tradition could conjure have now become manifest. Reality itself is teaching moral lessons in the form of the socially equalizing calamity of the war. Bernshteyn's faith in the possibility and efficacy of an ethical communal response to the calamity remains unshaken in a drash he wrote on the book of Ruth for Shavuos 1941. Describing Ruth as an ancient patriarchal story of family calamity and family loyalty, Bernshteyn asserts that, quote, in the year 5701, we hear Ruth as an idyll about hunger. Ruth, Bernshteyn comments, quote, is a story of famine and homelessness, but also of human loyalty. Hunger and homelessness become a touchstone for human loyalty. Misfortune engenders the need for social aid. Ruth walks behind the reapers and gathers ears of grain. Boaz takes Ruth under his wing and marries her. That love born in calamity is blessed by God. King David is born in one of the branches of their children. A wonderful tale about hunger and homelessness, which are transformed into human solidarity and social aid, ending in love and being blessed by heaven. Is this not a symbol that hunger and homelessness must lead to loyalty between people, to protection, to love? Life's difficulties create the possibility for great virtue. Ruth does not abandon Naomi in her great need, and Boaz lends protection to the solitary woman. Calamity offers occasion for ethical deeds. Calamity carries great virtue in the folds of its garment, end quote. Admittedly, the hermeneutic dictates of an occasional drosh such as this might encourage Bernshteyn to distill the most optimistic lessons possible under the increasingly dire circumstances. That he wasn't always so sanguine about the community's ability to meet what he saw as the ethical challenges of the calamity becomes evident in several texts. In Der Kelmer Magid, written sometime in 1941, it's undated, Bernshteyn repeatedly poses the rhetorical question, where is the Kelmer Magid, i.e. Moses Isaac ben Noah Darshan, the most celebrated Magid of the 19th century? Who or what, that is, amid the horrors of the ghetto, could reimpose the moral paradigm for which his invocation of the Magid does shorthand? A preacher in the terror tradition, the Kelmer Magid, in Bernshteyn's description, ignited congregations with terror, Shrek, of retribution, but solemn, and, quote, called forth human consciences amid cries and wailing, end quote. Where is the Kelmer Magid, Bernshteyn asks, who could frighten people into moral rectitude with visions of punishment and hell, Genem, now, when Genem is manifest in the streets and famine is coming for them all? The concrete backdrop for the 1941 writings in which Bernshteyn grapples with famine should be borne in mind. The ghetto was sealed in November 1940, and by spring 1941, the death rate due to disease and starvation began to skyrocket, peaking in August 1941 at 5,560 for that single month. If the concretized masholim of the bombardment of Warsaw affected moral improvement, humility, empathy, solidarity, now the hellish reality fails to awaken people's blunted moral conscience. And now I'm going to read a longer quote from Der Kelmer Magid. And I'm quoting rather at length in this talk because Bernshteyn has been been barely quoted or known until now. So here's the quote. Don't you believe in retribution? Don't you believe that for the sins of Sodom, a rain of fire will come from the sky, that sins call forth flood, a flood, that sins call forth annihilation, mida keneged mida, measure for measure? You don't believe in hell, Genem? You who walk the streets of Warsaw in 1941, you don't believe in Genem? Or do you believe in Genem for others, but not for yourselves? You clever ones, rationalists, apikorsum, who don't believe in Genem, who are not pained by the suffering of others, who don't go mad when you walk over streets paved with children's skulls. Hear, calm and assured people, and be disquieted. A plague is coming to destroy us, to annihilate us. The bloody spit from the starving, every breath from their wasted bodies, every vapor emitted from their blood and marrow, the curse said silently by their bodies, and the creeping prayer they say aloud will ignite wrath. When so neglected, hunger becomes infested with maggots and is transformed into a scythe that cuts rich and poor. Retribution is at our doors, the relentless specter, man and woman, young and old, poor and rich, mida keneged mida, measure for measure. Where can you find the Kelmer Magid who would cast terror over you like a choking rope around your throats, who would melt your stone hearts, who would extract from you as with tongs the resolution to share your last bit of food with the hungry, who would compel you to decide to act? Where can you find the stringent, angry Jew, the Kelmer Magid, who would make consciences shudder, who would show you another realm of hell, namely retribution for the deaths of brothers by starvation, when the first realm, famine, is not sufficient? Where can you find a Kelmer Magid who would break you to make you whole? End quote. Retribution is coming for everyone in the form of death by starvation, regardless of social or economic position, age, or gender. Mutual support, Bernshteyn submits, is the only path to collective salvation, yet people's consciences are so deadened by the terror sermon manifest in the Genem of the ghetto streets that it has no efficacy as a moral teaching. What vision of terrible punishment could a Magid possibly summon or conjure that would be effective when the hell people witness daily can't jolt them into acting ethically? I don't have time in this short talk to say much about what I consider Bernshteyn's single most stunning text about famine, disease, and destitution in the Warsaw Ghetto, his apocalyptic prose poem, Warsaw 5701, which is dated according to the traditional Jewish calendar as in Tammuz 5701. It opens with a prolonged apostrophe to Warsaw, including the lines, "Warsaw, you glare and dazzle as if with precious stones, with scurvy and boils that blossom on human faces and on tortured bodies. Warsaw, you are an altar for the helpless and a living memorial to Satan, a memorial to extinguished consciences. Warsaw, you are vast and sinful. You are pain and misfortune," end quote. The apocalyptic tone sets the stage for the arresting images of the quasi-allegorical figures who populate the text, the maimed, starving, marginalized, and dying, whose appeals for aid fall on deaf ears. Bernshteyn presents the dying as sacred figures, as iridescent prophets who burn, blaze, and sputter, illuminating the ghetto's hellscape. The ghetto has not become devoid of the sacred. On the contrary, it is the scene of an awful, awesome, sacred excess, an orgy of the sacred from which practical ethical lessons can hardly be drawn. Bernshteyn laments repeatedly, "Warsaw, you are a cemetery," Besakurus, you're a cemetery of consciences. The death of conscience runs like a leitmotif throughout Bernshteyn's Ghetto writings, and this essay is something of an explosive turning point. The assertion that moral consciences are dead remains the fierce judgment and call to concern for others that it has been across Bernshteyn's earlier texts, but it also shades into a desperate acknowledgement that traditional moral conscience is dead in a still bleaker sense, that it can have little purchase on the overwhelming circumstances. The death of consciences is not merely so many individual failures, but a collapse of the category as the guarantor of moral agency. This crisis in moral agency comes to the fore in an undated text, Kiddush Hashem, in which Bernshteyn contrasts the situation of Jewish martyrs of old with that of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. In In 1950s Poland, Bear Mark, then head of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, read this text as indicative of an unhealthy mystical longing for martyrdom. But the longing at issue is clearly for the slimmest measure of agency by which the medieval martyrs were able to render their deaths meaningful. Quote, "We thirst for the beauty and pain, for the beauty of pain and suffering from one's own resolve. We thirst for the heroism of the lion-hearted who order themselves to their knees in the service of holiness, of something higher than one's own life. We thirst for the beauty and heroism, the grandeur and glory, hod and tephora, of martyrdom, of free choice, because we were not given a choice," end quote. In contrast to the venerated martyrs of old who chose death over conversion, quote, "We are suffering and dying without the consciousness of an accomplished mission," end quote. The loss of moral agency remains a central concern of Yom Kippur, the final text I'll discuss. In contrast to in his Shavuos Drosh on Ruth, Bernshteyn here meditates not on what lessons Warsaw's Jews should be learning from the awful circumstances, but rather on whether helpless people can be judged. As the community's sins and fate are being weighed, they have but one defense, their abjection. Quote, "Warsaw, it's eternally Yom Kippur in you now. Bodies are aflame and souls sputter. Over your buildings and walls, measures and scales rise to heaven, and your fate is being weighed, worthy or guilty. Your accusing angels go in black and prepare for your day of judgment, but there is no defending angel for you, there for you. Helplessness is your defender, impotence, piteousness, and decline. Piteousness and decline cry impotently, for can you judge helplessness? End quote. Bernshteyn repeats the charge he makes in many previous texts that, quote, one's heart doesn't feel the suffering of others, end quote. Now, however, such lack of empathy points less to the community's moral failure than to its having fallen beneath the threshold of moral agency altogether. The community stands before God on Yom Kippur not as so many human beings, but as abject human worms. And now I'll read the last longer quote that I'll read here and finish. Quote, a sinful community stands and laments. We have long forgotten the 10 commandments. The wind has wiped away the words from the stone and their imprints in our hearts. We can't remember them, the 10 commandments. God's finger once wrote them for human beings who resemble God, but not for human worms. We don't remember them. We don't understand them. One's heart doesn't feel another's pain. It doesn't even feel one's own pain. Feeling has been silenced. We no longer know what suffering is because we don't feel. We don't know what such a thing as compassion is, and we don't understand justice. We've forgotten it. We knew it in our earlier existence when we felt sin consciously and of our own free will. Today, we are worms, 1,000 times more wretched than slaves. Or did you write the 10 commandments for worms? We step on each other. We raise ourselves up one over others with pride. Keep the storehouses locked so that, God forbid, none of the starving should partake. Written for human beings who resemble God, the laws don't apply to us. We are human worms, so can we be judged for not upholding the laws of human gods? Above our walls rise measures and scales, worthy or guilty. The scales teeter as in a tempest. They vacillate and fall silent, end quote. If, quote, if our helplessness is our armor before God and before decent people and before Satan, end quote, such protection from condemnation is paid by the loss of human status. Abjection has entailed the collapse of the paradigm of moral judgment, put the divine scales of judgment out of commission, and left them teetering silently in the storm. By way of conclusion, I want to emphasize how, for Bernshteyn, ethics both are and are not suspended in the face of the increasingly dire circumstances of the Warsaw Ghetto. He diagnoses a collapse in the viability of ethics and judgment, but very much from within an ethical framework and discourse. That is, he continues to use ethics as a prism for interpreting horrible realities, even after these realities have eroded the preconditions for ethical judgment. Bernshteyn's ethical thinking does not stop at the threshold of its own impossibility. The crisis that Bernshteyn tried to meet with ethical interpretation and admonishment eventually engulfed the very categories undergirding such strategies. Yet Bernshteyn continues to think and to write in an ethical mode. His ethics in crisis give anguished, arresting, unsettling, and at times terrifyingly beautiful voice to the experience of the catastrophe unfolding in real time. Thank you.